Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about using security ratings to assess and monitor vendor risk. I'm coming to you today from the UK, but I see we have attendees today from all over the world, so very welcome, everybody. My name is Ronan Lavelle, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Elasticito, and we are a UK-based, but we work on a global basis, cyber risk advisory and managed services business. So we work with companies all over the world to help them to define cyber risk programs, particularly around third-party risk. And we also help them to manage those programs where they need and want some help as well. We use automation technologies to make process improvements as well. So a little bit of housekeeping for today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow sometime, so within 24 hours. We would love you to ask some questions today if you have any burning questions that appear throughout the event today. Can I ask that you use the Zoom Q&A button and not the chat? And that's only because the chat messages actually appear in the recording. So if you don't want your question to be visible to the public, please use the Q&A button. And we will answer those questions at the end of the event. So just before we kick off, and just to set the scene a little bit, it'd be great to understand where people are at today with regards to assessing vendor risk. So I'm going to launch a little poll, if you like. This is completely anonymous, but it would be great if you could just give us an indication about where you are in your process maturity around vendor risk assessments. I'll get a few more seconds. Super, thank you very much. So basically, most of you are assessing risks using risk assessment questionnaires. Some of you don't have formal processes and programs in place today. So I'd like to actually address, hopefully, both of those use cases in today's session. And this is really about not replacing things that you do today that you might think are very good, but simply embellishing and making existing processes more efficient and more scalable. So why do we want to assess cyber risk with vendors anyway? I think the key difference between today and sort of 10 or 15 years ago is the way that our world has become digital and our operations have become digital. We now work with more and more third and indeed fourth parties to do and transact our business and to actually deliver products and services to customers. And increasingly, we are sharing critical data, or those third parties have access to our networks, or they might even have access to our facilities and premises. If those third parties and fourth parties that you work with you can answer those three questions. So do they have access to your network? Are you sharing your data, your customer data with them? Do they have access to your premises? And maybe also, are they operationally important to you? So if they go down, do you go down, kind of a use case? Then really you want to be monitoring and assessing the risk for those vendors. So historically, if we're being true to ourselves, companies have assessed risk initially because they had to, because a regulator or somebody told them they had to do that. And we've seen a lot of that in the European Union in particular in the last 5 years around privacy with GDPR. But I think now, as business operations become more digital, there is a business continuity and a core business risk requirement to track and monitor vendor risk as well. And cyber is playing obviously an increasingly important role in that. The Ponemon Institute, which is a sort of independent research organization based in the United States, ran a really interesting survey in 2021 that showed that about 44% of companies that they surveyed had experienced a data breach as a direct result of a third party having a data breach. So the third party compromised the primary party's data. But what was most interesting for me was that over half of the companies they surveyed actually had no formal programs in place at all to track and monitor that third-party risk. So today's webinar is really all about trying to address that issue. It's that there are programs in place for some companies, but still a huge number of companies may be looking at this, but haven't put anything in place yet today. So what's wrong with maybe some of the existing processes? So obviously the traditional way to assess risk, and in particular cyber risk, is to send a risk assessment questionnaire to your third party. So here's an example of one. This is actually a questionnaire called the Shared Assessment SIG questionnaire, so Standard Information Gathering Questionnaire. This one actually has 1,619 questions in it. So I think, and I think our clients also think that that's quite burdensome. It's burdensome for the recipient, and it's really a huge admin overhead for the analyzer, for the company that is looking to assess and analyze that risk. So what we're going to try and do is to show you a slightly different way to do this, but still to complement the internal risk assessment process using questionnaires, but using technology to assist us. And one of the reasons why we want to do this is because in many cases, information security are just another internal stakeholder group. And you and we work with other internal stakeholders, and we have either formal or semi-formal kind of service level agreements with our business colleagues. So I predominantly would think of people like procurement. So increasingly information security risk teams are being asked to assess cyber risk, for instance, with a short list of vendors that procurement are looking to select or evaluate on behalf of another business stakeholder function. Currently, the way that we assess risk through risk assessment questionnaires that are typically sent out as an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document or an interactive PDF or something via email to the third party, it's very slow, it's very paper-based, it's very cumbersome, and it takes, on average, about 4 to 6 weeks to get a completely filled out and completed questionnaire with all of the remediation actions documented. And that means it's also quite costly. So if you do this yourself, and you need to do this in a comprehensive way, you're probably dedicating quite a large number of resources to do this, and that costs a lot of money. Or equally, you're using external resources, which equally costs a lot of money as well, but doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the timelines. So if you were in procurement and you did, if for instance, enact and invite information security or your corporate risk team to assess the cyber risk of a vendor, and it takes 4 weeks, some might argue that that's not a great service level commitment to the business. So what we're trying to say is that in some cases, maybe not all cases, it is possible to radically have an upheaval to this process and improve not only the responsiveness and the timelines, but also the cost and the resources that are required to assess and then continually update and monitor the risk profile of that external party. And going a little bit further, if you were to speak with our friends at Gartner about how vendor risk management breaks down into its different classifications and categories, our customers at Elasticito that we surveyed last year believe that there is significant opportunities for automation using technology, but also with services, to make a significant impact, process improvement impact in different parts of the vendor cyber risk lifecycle process. So whether that's identifying risk, so looking at inherent risk profiles and understanding actually, do we need to ask all the key questions for an external vendor who is not going to be processing or sharing our data, or they do not have access to our network. So why are we sending them 50 questions about privacy and about network access? And indeed, around the whole risk assessment, there's a significant improvement that could be potentially made, but also around the analysis. So can technology be used to help you make better decisions around what is a risky profile and what isn't? And indeed, what would be an acceptable risk for you and your business stakeholders as well? So we would like ultimately our customers to focus on analysis and adding value to your business internal customers, and not necessarily on inefficient admin processes. So either let people like us and other vendors do the admin, you focus on the value adding tasks. So if it's okay today, I'm going to do a bit of a live demonstration. I'm going to use a platform called Black Kite, which is a cyber risk monitoring platform. And I'm going to go through a number of scenarios that we think our customers at Elasticito ask us about all the time. So the first use case we're going to look at, and I'm going to go into this in not too much detail, and I'm be more than happy to have future deeper dive sessions on this if you wanted to, or even privately arranged sessions. But we're going to look at how you can use technology to assess and monitor critical vendors, and even vendors that you and your systems have never assessed before. But then also, how do you service other internal stakeholder groups in in a responsive way? So we're going to look at that procurement due diligence use case as well. Then we're going to look at, is it possible to manage huge numbers of vendors? So not just the maybe 10 or 30 or 50 critical vendors, but maybe the 50 or the 100 or the thousands of vendors. And how do you pick out the ones that are really important to you and the ones that are maybe presenting the biggest risk to you? And then the other use case that we get a lot from our customers is what happens when there's a major either industry or world event. So an industry event could be, for instance, there was a major breach with an authentication platform called Okta a few months ago, or Log4j, for instance, and people scurry around trying to assess and survey their supplier base to understand who's affected by this, what is the status of it, or equally, who has operations in Ukraine, for instance, or Russia, which was a hugely important issue for our customers earlier in 2022. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I'm going to reshare my screen, if that's all right. And again, I should just remind you, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function within the dashboard, and be more than happy to answer those questions at the end. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see my screen here. I'm going to come back to this particular dashboard in a moment, but I want to start very quickly with the question everybody always has, which is when you use tools, and in this case we're using Black Kite, but we are aware that you have choice and there are other options. We just happen to think that Black Kite is an awesome platform. But some of these platforms are kind of database centric. So there's a kind of finite number of vendors that are in that database that are being monitored or assessed. And it's the same with Black Kite, but also not. So here, if you want to assess a new company and you've never done that before, you don't need to come to your service provider like Elasticito or the vendor. You just simply do it yourself. We have this notion of ecosystems. So I could say, for instance, put this into my critical third parties folder or bucket, if you like. And I'm just going to put in a thing here, example corp. This is actually one of our sample companies. It actually does exist. So it's going to do a quick lookup to see, actually, does that company exist already? In my case, it actually does, but I'm going to ignore that and say that I want a different one. And all I actually now need to do is is to put in the domain. So actually going to just put in example.com. So that is all you need to do in order to kick off an assessment. And if it's a subsidiary of a global company, you can select that. If it's a hosting provider or a large infrastructure provider, you can select that button, and that means that we're assessing the company and not any of their shared customer infrastructure, for instance. So if it's a telco, for instance. And when I click submit, I won't do that because I already have this company here, but in about, depending on the time of the day, but within between 5 and 20 minutes, we will have a really deeply technical cyber risk report that would look something akin to this. So here is example corp. So this is actually a real, but it's a fictitious company. So the data is real, but it's not actually any particular commercial company that we're going to show you here. But here we can see we have a cyber risk dashboard, if you like, for this company. And again, instead of waiting for 2 weeks to get an initial view on risk, you can still send out a questionnaire if you want to this vendor, but I'm now looking at a view of this critical third party. And I can immediately see some things that might cause some concern or maybe want to ask more questions of this vendor. So I can see that we use things like very simple to understand A to F grading and 0 to 100%, for instance. We also quantify the risk to us using a thing called the FAIR model, if you're familiar with the FAIR model and cyber risk quantification models. And we map this to different compliance frameworks. So this company is not looking too great on those fronts. So if I was going to share data with them, I also want to look at maybe their historical track record of reportable data breaches. So the pointer here is in the green zone. I don't have too many concerns about that. But if another one of my questions would be, is this vendor potentially operationally important to us? And in the digital and cyber world, if we ignore DDoS attacks for a moment, the major threats and risks to our clients' business operations would be where critical vendors suffer operational outages due to ransomware. So we call this out specifically within this platform, and we look specifically at about 150 different ransomware, essentially health indicators, all backed up with evidence-based data. And here we can see that this company has a mild to medium ransomware risk. So it's not that they will be attacked, it's more like a doctor's note. You're not looking very healthy. You probably need to fix some things to raise your defenses. So we can see some things that this dashboard here is designed very specifically where we're looking at one company view to enable anyone, whether it's procurement or information security or IT or even anyone in the business, to be able to understand the risk profile of this company. Our company at Elasticito work a lot, by the way, on operational cyber risk models where depending on the inherent risk category or the vendor category that they fit into, we will quite often look at these different sub-risk categories and give you a steer on whether it's totally acceptable to have a B in email security and DNS, or whether that would be unacceptable for the type of risk profile that you're looking. So on that, obviously, we're looking at 20 odd different categories here. And here we can dig down into lots of detail if we want to. Again, all of this information was gathered very, very rapidly, generally through open source data sources, and it is usually pretty up to date. And when I say pretty up to date, it is going to be within probably a couple of days in terms of its currency. And so we can look at a whole lot of different things here. We can dig into the details, what the vulnerable assets would be, and you can work with your vendors to remediate different issues. They can you can share these dashboards with your vendor, with the external party. There's no extra cost, for instance, for that. But we also have a thing called a strategy report. So if we were reviewing this company, they're a critical vendor of ours. I'm not going to go through the details today, but there's all the technical findings behind here where we provide the evidence-based data that supports these different gradings. And you can share this information with the vendor, but you can also share different reports or different things either with internal stakeholders or external ones. One of these reports is a thing called a remediation strategy report. So in the old days, this was something that you would pay a very expensive consulting organization to work with your external vendors and create that job list of to-dos, if you like, in order of priority. And this platform creates that strategy report on the fly for any vendor that we assess. So here, for instance, is this strategy report for this company here. And it says that currently they are here in terms of cyber risk ratings. The financial impact is this, and the compliance rating is 79%. But if they went through 4 rough and high-level stages and remediated these different subcategories, then you could be here in terms of cyber risk. So this is a substantial improvement, by the way, in the risk profile of this company, where you might have rejected them before for having such a terrible risk profile, but now we're able to actually share with them a risk-based priority report, and this breaks down into a step-by-step. These are the critical things that you really do need to look at as a matter of urgency. You can export these into an interface where you can share them via workflow, send them to IT, send them to your vendor, send them to your hosting company, whoever owns the asset or the issue to be remediated, and off you go. So that is something that is really very useful. I'm going to go, if I may, into a slightly different use case, which is the second one. And we'll come back, if you like, to the detailed analysis of single company views. I want to jump, if I may, into what we call an ecosystem view. So here in particular, I'm going to look at a little category that I have here called HR vendors. So if you imagine here we are assessing risk on behalf of our internal colleagues in procurement, for instance. So they're working with HR, who are looking to maybe purchase and use an HR platform for payroll or for employee incentives, all these kind of things. So there are a whole load of these vendors. I'm only choosing the top 3 because they're in the top 3 here, but there are many choices, as I mentioned before. So here we can see some fairly globally famous vendors in this space. So we have a company called Workday, we have a company called Taleo, which is owned by Oracle, and we have a company called SuccessFactors, which is owned by SAP. And there are, as I said, many others we could also assess. And what we're able to do at the highest level here is to look at a slightly different view, almost like a helicopter view of risk for these companies. So when I'm in this column-based view, I can, by the way, dictate what columns I want to use in my assessments. So I've just simply chosen, I want to look at the grade, the rating, the financial impact, their compliance, and then I want to look at the data breach index. So what's their incidence of reported data breaches, and I want to look at their ransomware risk. Okay, so I can go into, say, a company like Workday, just like we did with our example.com, and we have the same kind of view, right? This one, as you remember, or if you remember from the previous example, looks a bit different to the former one. But I'm also going to ask you to look at this probable financial risk rating. So here we're looking at this column here, because if I was to send a report back to procurement that said, oh yeah, well, we've got SuccessFactors, they're a B minus, and Workday are a B, and Oracle Tally are a C. So, hey, maybe that's saying that from a technical risk perspective, then maybe you should shortlist these 2 vendors and maybe this one because it's slightly better, but maybe only slightly better. So what I've done in the background here, a little bit like one of these cooking shows on TV, I've set some parameters already, and I've used a thing called the FAIR model, which is a not-for-profit organization that has created a risk quantification model that is now an open standard. And it's really all about data breaches and the cost of a data breach. So because we're going to share HR records with these vendors, I put in that we're going to share 5,000 records with each vendor. I also put in that I'm in the United Kingdom, which is where my legal jurisdiction is, and I've put in where these vendors are from. So they're from the United States. So I'm looking at joint legal jurisdiction, and that, by the way, equates to things like regulator fines and so on. So interesting enough, I can see that, yes, okay, Workday has a slightly better technical risk, but it also has a lower financial risk, has a slight incidence in data breach reporting, but it's got a fairly low or negligible ransomware risk. So that looks quite good. However, this vendor here doesn't look so good. So it's got a technical rating that's a bit lower, and it's got a higher potential financial impact score to us as well if our data was to be compromised within their environment. And that's, by the way, on a per breach basis. It's not the total balance cost. So that's very useful to use. I can also give procurement like comparison reports. And I can do this, by the way, not in 4 weeks or in 1 month or whatever, or 1 week, but actually do this within 1 hour. So I can set this, mark these vendors here to what we call a benchmark. And I can now do some side-by-side comparison, and I can send these off to procurement to make their, with our opinion about what we think the risk profile looks like. So here we can look at some side-by-side comparisons from the 3 vendors that we've shortlisted. And we can see that actually, on average, this vendor here, Workday, has a consistently higher risk score than, say, other ones here as well. So, success factors is also not too shabby, but this vendor here, they're actually, by the way, they're all world-class vendors, don't get me wrong, but if you're comparing them side by side, then that is something to maybe look at. Also, one of the things that we look at is the variance between bad and good. So we want to have a variation or a variance score that is as narrow as possible, but also as good as possible, if you like. So we want to see this variance as high up this scale as possible, but also with a narrower frequency between low scores and high scores. So again, we're looking at Workday is looking like the leader there as well. And we can have some other charts that would back that up as well. We can then do some tabular comparisons. So here we're looking at the platform we're using here called Black Kite assesses different risk categories. So safeguarding, infrastructure, privacy, resiliency, and reputation. And again, and they break down into these different subcategories. But you can then see from a top level perspective, which ones are looking more healthy from a risk perspective, and which ones are maybe not. And again, breaking that down, you can see that in more detail. So this is quite awesome analysis to be able to give to your colleagues in lightning fast speed. And I don't know if you've ever tried to assess any of the vendors I'm showing you on screen here, but some of them, and I'm not going to name any names, don't take too kindly to companies sending them risk assessment questionnaires. Some of them either say no, others may try and charge money for the completion of those questionnaires, and others, or increasingly others, publish their risk assessments on publicly available portals, which is not at all bad either. We may also, by the way, have a slightly more advanced view on risk. So here we have a thing called a list view, and rather than just take the categories that have been presented to me, so in this tabular view here, these are all the categories that we assess, so these are therefore the categories we're going to give you. However, there are certain categories that may be more important to you and other categories that may be less important. So if you are at that level of maturity, you can, in fact, manipulate those categories. So for instance, the classic one of credentials. So there are leaked credentials out there, and we in this platform will alert you that your vendor has hundreds or thousands of leaked credentials with whatever risk attached to them. You may ask them questions about their mitigations to address that risk, and that might be things like, we use multi-factor authentication, we do user awareness training around security, we change our core passwords every 30 or 90 days or whatever. And that may be okay to you. So maybe we don't want to look at credentials as a core risk indicator because it's actually just muddying the water a little bit. But maybe we do want, for instance, to know the ransomware risk and the data breach impact risk as well. We might also want to look at things like network security and application security. So if those are the things that are important to you, let's refilter and recategorize the way that we're looking at these vendors and see, does that change our opinion about the risk that we're presenting to the business? Okay, and I guess this is ultimately all about that. This is about you in information security making a recommendation to the business on the risk that you think that they should accept. And it could well be that you accept a vendor that has a higher risk profile, maybe because their commercials are great and actually that you have mitigated the perceived risk to your business. But really, you can then get the business to buy into and accept that risk themselves. That's really what we're talking about there. Okay, so let me jump into a slightly different view here. And here I'm going to talk about looking at not one vendor or not three vendors, but in this case, I'm going to look at 2,300 vendors. So this is, looking at vendor risk from a huge macro level. So, in this environment here, we can look at all of our global vendors, so not just the IT ones, but also the the marketing, the HR, the finance, the production, IT vendors, and all these kind of people, all by country. We can fly into different different territories and environments. We can also look at pick out the problem children, if you like. So in this particular view, I haven't split this into inherent risk categories, but we could do that as well. So we can have, like, data sharing vendors or critical vendors, or however you want to classify that, high, medium, low risk. But what I can do here is I can say, well, our operational risk model says that really, if we're going to work with vendors where we share data, they need to be a B grade or higher, for instance. And that's just a flippant statement I've just made there. So maybe we want to look at vendors that are presenting us the worst risk. So these ones maybe we want to have some remediation and action plans on, and we might want to project manage, for instance, share those strategy reports with them, understand who are those C grade people, and can we monitor and manage that risk acceptably in an acceptable manner, or do we need to do something else about that and maybe make other decisions? Okay. Equally, we can assess risk from other perspectives as well. So apologies, my dashboard is loading a bit slow. It's probably my Zoom session. But sometimes it's useful to look at risk from different perspectives. So I showed you where we were slightly more mature in our risk assessment process, where we were including or excluding technical categories in our comparison tables. Equally here, in these dashboards here, we can compare different things. So here, we want to compare operational risks, so things like ransomware susceptibility, with their technical grade. So if you're down here somewhere with a very high ransomware risk and a very low technical grade, that means something really, or it should do to you. So you should probably make sure that you're at least in communication with these vendors, and you want to understand, how important are they to your business, and what are they doing about addressing some of these risks if they can address them. So, maybe the red and the scarlet red vendors here are the ones where you want to really focus your attention. So again, I'm talking about a huge number of vendors here, so over 2,000. So I'm not necessarily saying that the poor people on today's call need to manage that number of vendors. But what I'm saying is that you can do, and you can pick out, um, um, the problem companies in a really easy capacity, really easy way here as well, and keep tag of, if I'm responsible for a particular portfolio of suppliers and vendors, or I'm responsible for making sure that critical vendors are above a certain level. We have customers, by the way, that have OKRs, and they set objectives based on cyber risk scores of themselves and their key vendors. So again, this is all something that can be used here. But you can have different dashboards. So, if you're working with your financial colleagues in finance, and they want to look at technical and cyber risk from a financial perspective, and sometimes this translates into things that they understand, either like quantification, or for instance, like cyber insurance policies as well. So this is beginning to play a lot more in the cyber insurance world. So not only are cyber insurers using these kind of tools to assess your company's risk, but as you may have noticed, in 2022, cyber insurance policies have just gone through the roof. 18, 90% increases in policy premiums. So it's really important to understand, what do you look like, what your key vendors look like, what is the risk to your company if you and or your vendor were compromised. So again, you can have different views. Some of these are quite advanced ones based on different quantification models, and again, trends over time, and also looking at risk from slightly different views. So here we can see our top 100 riskiest third parties, and we can fly into ones that present the highest technical risk, but also the highest financial risk as well. And you can cut this data any way you like. So it's kind of cool. Okay, so again, today's really not intended to be a really big deep dive, but I want to just jump back, if I may, into my fourth use case, which is, how do you react when there is a major industry or a world event that keeps you up at night? And unfortunately, last November and December, a lot of the people on today's call probably had very late nights working with the Log4j issue. I'm sure you won't forget that in a hurry. But one of the major problems with third parties and Log4j was trying to understand who was affected, if they were affected, did they have a remediation plan in place, and what were they doing about it? And the same thing could be said for other things, like, there's a major compromise discovered in Cisco or in Okta, for instance. So if I want to look at, say, let's just look at Cisco, for instance. So this was about 6 weeks ago. Some very major vulnerabilities reported. Obviously, many of your third parties and many of your fourth parties will almost certainly use Cisco kit. So, the default position for most of our customers is, oh gosh, we need to create a custom questionnaire, and we need to poll or survey all of our vendor base and understand who's using this product, what are they doing about it, and so on. So we can help you massively by shortcutting that process. So here we have these things called dynamic tags, and they do go away every now and then when the issue is no longer important. But for instance, we did a quick search here on everyone that is a reported Cisco customer. And we gather this data from different sources, and it is generally peer reviewed and trustworthy, I should say. And you can use these filters in a very interesting way. So, not so much in Europe, but our colleagues in the United States have quite a lot of interest, for instance, in Taiwan. And right now, from a geopolitical perspective, Taiwan is a fairly major manufacturing base in the semiconductor industry and whatever. So if that affects your business or could affect your business from an operational perspective, you need to know that. So again, what vendors do you have in your world? Actually, I don't have any here that have operations in that location, for instance. So it could be a technical thing, or it could be a geopolitical or any other item as well. It could also be, who in my world. So I can assess a company from an individual perspective and look at their ransomware risk, but from a vendor risk perspective, am I able to just do like a daily review on the companies that are important to my business, and have any of them reported ransomware incidents in the last 90 days? And in my world, these are some of those companies that have done that. And obviously, and very unfortunately, with the latest evolution and generation of ransomware attacks, they also come with them data breaches as well. So, these are this is quite useful and important information to know as well. So really, I think that's as much as I wanted to show you today from using technology and a tool set to assess and monitor cyber risk. And I think, so just to go through those use cases again, we showed you running a new risk assessment for a company you've never heard of before, providing like a really deep analysis of that technical data. There are, by the way, other things I haven't shown you around importing documentation like policy documents or SOC 2 reports or audit reports and these kind of things into that platform, and then mapping them to different control frameworks, which again massively saves time. But then also looking at comparisons between different vendors for things like procurement processes and so on. So that's quite useful. And then bubbling this up to your whole program, how do you manage that without going crazy, and then reacting to industry and world events? So that's that. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. That we do have one question, and please just type your questions in the Q&A button. It's at the bottom of your screen, or it should be. So the question I have here are emerging risks, including climate change risk and other ESG risks, included in this analysis? And thank you for asking that question. So the platform I just showed you is a cyber risk monitoring platform, and therefore it does not include climate change and ESG and financial risks and geopolitical risks. However, Elasticito also provides a parallel solution that provides all of the financial ESG, climate change, PEP monitoring, all that kind of stuff for business and operational risk monitoring as well. And when we started doing this 5 years ago, there was a huge separation between cyber risk monitoring and essentially business and operational risk monitoring, and those two worlds are very much coming together now, where really they need to be one and the same. So we are increasingly including those together. But Camilla, if you want to message me offline privately, we'll very happily show you the other platform that does the ESG monitoring. So now another question I've just received is, can I use this solution to help with compliance with DORA? And if so, how? Very topical question. So for those of you who are not in Europe and not in the financial services sector, DORA is a new, very wide-ranging digital and operational resilience piece of legislation. So it's kind of like what GDPR was for privacy, but for digital operations and risk. And so while what I've shown you today is absolutely not an end-to-end panacea solution to comply with DORA, it absolutely is something that will save you huge amounts of time and effort in monitoring DORA requirements and keeping on top of them. So DORA, for instance, has a specific call out section around vendors. So not just the vendor's requirement to develop software and services in a secure way, but the recipient of those services to be on top of risk assessments and monitoring the acceptable risk to your business. So everything I've spoken about today would absolutely fall within the guise of DORA. But I mean, today we've been talking mainly about third parties and external parties, but you can use these monitoring tools to assess your own organization or your own group companies if you're part of a conglomerate. And again, DORA has some requirements around that as well, about being able to regularly assess risk and monitor that risk as well. I have a couple more questions on screen, and by the way, these are great questions, so please continue to ask them. So one question here is, isn't this just an outside view? So it is. So what I showed you today was publicly available data that shows an organization from the outside in, but I would almost strongly argue that in today's world, there's increasingly a very little difference between an inside view and an outside view. We're ultimately talking about digital infrastructure. That is, hosted infrastructure. It's public service, cloud services. It's what is acceptable and visible from the outside. Like, am I able to spoof your email? Am I able to get your employees' credentials? Am I able to set up fraudulent domains and apps and exploit your customers or your users or your supplier and vendors, customers? So everything really, I guess, it's a wider scope of what we're talking about. But because we get this question an awful lot, I want to just quickly flick forward a bit, because I have this slide always at the back of my presentations, and we would always argue, this is slightly a humorous version of to answer your question, that if you looked at the yard or the garden or the front driveway of a property and it looks something like this, it's highly unlikely that the inside of the property is going to look like this, right? And it may well be that it's totally okay to be totally messy and shabby on the inside, because that vendor may be completely insignificant to the risk profile of your business. But if this is one of your vendors and you are sharing data with them, they do have staff access, say they're an outsourcing provider, their people have access to your network, they also have access to your premises, for instance, or they're operationally important, then you do kind of want them to look like this on the inside, I would argue. And so this is why we would say combine these tools that do these rapid assessments with evidence-based data from the outside with internal risk assessment tools that take longer to get back from the vendors and more effort, but maybe provide more information about internal controls and mitigations for presentable risks. Okay. Another question is, where do we get our data from? So that's in very short order, hundreds of different data sources is the quick answer. The platform uses mainly open source data that any person on today's call, but also any cyber criminal can also have access to. So when you hear about an attack like a couple of instances just in the last 10 days or so in the US, where assets were scanned on the internet, user credentials were harvested, people exploited people's tolerance for things like multi-factor authentication notifications. All these kind of things all form part of this, and we can help you to give you visibility on what a bad actor can view about your company or a third party, essentially, and do that really, really rapidly with very little resources. And why should we believe your score, and what is the grading methodology you use, is a question I have here. So I guess I can't answer for other vendors, and these tools are a bit like weather forecasting tools, that they Again, I'm not a panacea, but they're hugely useful in helping you to form an opinion about risk. The tool I showed you today is not the only one in the marketplace, but I can talk authoritatively about that tool. And what the Black Kite platform uses is completely peer-reviewed risk models. So we spoke a little bit today about the FAIR model, which is a risk quantification model. You can go to the FAIR organization and search up on Google and look at how that methodology works. Otherwise, the platform uses a MITRE framework, risk framework, called the Cyber Threat Susceptibility Assessment Framework. Again, if you Google CTSA, you will find out all about the CTSA. But if you're familiar with vulnerability programs, it is an Uber framework that encapsulates vulnerabilities, weaknesses, attacker behaviors, all in one framework. So that's why we love that so much. Again, so we're using third-party data. We map it to the CTSA framework that gives you that A to F grading and the technical grade. So that's that. I'm out of questions on my side unless anyone else has any further questions. I would just maybe say, if you've liked what you've seen today, today is not really intended to be a sales meeting in any regards, but more informational. But if what you saw today was of interest to you and you'd like to get a completely no commitment free trial of that Black Kite platform, that can be completely arranged. But again, feel free to respond to that or not, but I'll leave that on the screen for a moment and we can respond to that later. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll leave that there. So I have no further questions and I will give you 10 more minutes back in your day. I hope you found today's session informative and useful, and that there is some kind of salvation out there using technology to automate some of your manual processes, but absolutely not a replacement for what you're doing already in most cases as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.